the second biggest monkey head I've ever seen.
I used to be an adventurer like you. Then I took an arrow in the knee.
The definition of insanity.
Hello and welcome to episode 52 of PvA Radio. I am your host, Luke Croft. Joining me as always, freelance gaming journalist, Cody Mellowkline. Cody, how are you doing, my friend?
I'm doing all right. Kind of just exhausted in general, but I'm surviving. How about you?
Doing, probably about the same. It's been a long week. Also joining us is friends hardly recognize him, ladies and gentlemen, Larry Hunt.
It's true. I grew my hair long, and just that simple change, I run into people that don't see me regularly, and they don't know who I am at first.
It's the ponytail.
Yeah.
Soon.
No.
Getting there.
Man bun.
The man bun.
No.
Larry has strong opinions about this, as we can tell from his
I
face.
mean, you can have a man bun, but I'm not going.
But I'll judge you.
I've got 1,000 other things to judge you for.
Good point. Well, this is PvA Radio. We get together each and every week, and each of us brings one of the biggest gaming news stories of the week to the table. Then we have an in-depth discussion about it. Consider it your collaborative audio feature article, or your CAFA, if you will. And Larry, what do we want people to do with that?
You're going to get some concrete. You're going to give your neighbor a new CAFA-shaped walkway, and you're also going to spam that emote in the chat.
All of these things are true. We do this live every Wednesday over here on twitch.tv/PvA Radio at 9:30 p.m. Eastern Time. If you can't catch us live, you can find us over on youtube.com/PvA Radio the very next day, or on podcast services everywhere. Wherever you're listening to us, we greatly appreciate it. Make sure you subscribe, leave a comment, leave a review. All of it goes a tremendous way in helping us to be discovered. And if you leave a review, we'll read it out, and Larry will read it using a very poorly done accent of some kind.
Absolutely.
He has no accents that are actually good, not even the one he normally talks with. All right, guys, a little bit of housekeeping here at the top. I apologize for not doing the nightly rundown last night. Work ran over, and I was just kind of exhausted from all the shitty news that I had to talk about the night before. But we're going to be back on track with this starting tomorrow, 9 p.m. Eastern Time over here on twitch.tv/PvA Radio. But I think that's pretty much it as far as housekeeping goes. Oh, we're also starting to publish some articles over on playerversusall.com. So make sure you go check that out. We got a little bit of a refreshed look. I won't call it a complete redesign, but we cleaned some things up, made it a little bit more user-friendly. All right, guys, let's jump right into it with what have you been playing? Larry, let's start with you. What have you been playing?
Just Apex. I didn't really have time to do much gaming this week, and so the little bit of time I did have, I spent playing my current favorite game.
Are you excited about solos?
I don't know. I feel like I could do really good at it, because I've had some games where I got to the end and one where I even won just by myself. So if the odds are balanced and it's just a bunch of solos, I think I might be able to win some of those. Pretty excited. Yeah.
Cool. Cody, how about you?
I have not been playing Apex, but I have been playing a few other things. I'm playing a little bit more Siege, trying to get back into it. Turns out, it's not a game you can go months without playing and expect to still be good at. I jumped back in and immediately started to get my ass kicked. It's a game you really have to keep on top of if you want to maintain any level of skill. Because I can guarantee you the people who are playing that game are playing a lot of it. But it's still, I love that game, and they've redone, I think they redid one of the maps, and they've released some operators that I haven't played as, because I bought the season pass at the beginning of, not this season, but the season before. I have a bunch of characters that I haven't played as yet, so I've been experimenting with them, having a good time. I beat the Banner Saga 3, which was, I now understand there are a ton of different endings to that game, and the ending I got was relatively underwhelming. But the other ending sounded pretty cool. I just made a bunch of shitty decisions along the way that resulted in a pretty lackluster end. But I liked the ramp up. Like I said last week, I don't think I've played a game that captures just like the sheer desperation and barely getting by the skin of your teeth experience of like just completely losing a war. And that's kind of what the third chapter of that game is. So I really enjoyed it. Game? I feel like I beat the third part in about 5 or 6 hours. They're not long. They basically are 3 parts of the same game that are just released in different segments. It was kickstarted. It was a Kickstarter project originally. But I would suggest anybody who likes turn-based combat or just like kind of interesting fantasy stories should play it. There's a lot of cool characters, a lot of really well-written dialogue, a lot of interesting choices you have to make where you could deliberate over them for hours on end. It's just a really interesting experience.
And the trilogy is on sale right now on the Switch, I believe, right?
I believe so. I got the third chapter for $10, and I think the other 2 chapters are also discounted as well. So seems like the perfect time to pick them up.
Cool. Anything else?
Yeah, the last thing is still Sekiro. I actually 30 minutes before I hopped on the show, I beat a wicked frustrating boss, and just like I was just hammering away at this thing for the last 3 days. Not like constantly, but like on and off. And I beat it 30 minutes before I came on, so I'm feeling pretty fucking energized from that.
I want to point out that's the most Boston thing I've ever heard you say too. A wicked. You said a wicked something boss.
Oh, did I?
Yeah.
Damn it. Wicked fucking pisser, dude. But yeah, that game is continuing to challenge me, and I just got to I think a pretty interesting point about the story and in terms of the gameplay. So I'm excited to continue pressing forward with my sword and my dagger at my side.
I didn't put it in the notes just because it's really the same thing as always. I've been playing League. I feel like I've regressed in League. Last night I got really mad. I'm not going to get into all why I got mad, but yeah. So, been playing League, and then it's funny, man. I feel like I'm at this spot with Overwatch where I am now waiting for a new game to come out as I wait for the 222 roll lock to be released on the live patch, because I know of many people who have said they're going to be jumping back in, and so I'm waiting for that day. I'm still playing every now and again on the PTR, but those games don't mean anything, so it's hard for me to get up for them. But yeah, so Overwatch I'm going to be playing a ton of come August 13th, which is next Tuesday.
Oh, really?
When when the beta season starts. So
okay.
They're running like a short abbreviated beta season on all platforms to just figure out, make sure it'll work. And then I think it's like September 1st, the full one's going to come.
I'm going to jump in for that.
I'm so excited for that. I can't believe how excited I am. Because for me, like in Overwatch, there's the frustration of people like playing poorly, and that's frustrating. But I hate when you jump in and everyone, like, nobody's willing to give on anything, and you just have to roll with a comp that you know isn't going to do anything. Like, that's the most frustrating thing.
Mm-hmm.
So at least forcing us into a somewhat viable comp, whether we want it or not, I appreciate it.
Yeah. So next week, that's right.
The best May and gold returns.
All right, guys. Well, let's jump right into our topics. And I'm starting us off this week. So we had some big news that came out today regarding loot boxes. The details for this story coming from The Verge by McKenna Kelly. So I'm going to summarize and then I'll read some quotes here. So the 3 major video game console manufacturers, Microsoft, Sony, and Nintendo, they've come together and they have committed to making some changes to the way that loot boxes are used in games, in the sense that they've committed to requiring drop rates to be publicized. So if you purchase a loot box, you will have transparency to be able to see, okay, I've got a 1 in 2,500 chance that I'm going to get an epic item out of this loot box, or what have you. And this was actually announced today by the ESA, who we'll be speaking about more later on in the show, during a loot box workshop at the Federal Trade Commission. Has anybody had a chance to look into what this loot box workshop at the FTC was? I'm genuinely asking because I'm very curious. It seems like a bunch of suits sitting around and not understanding a goddamn thing that anybody up at the front is talking about. But so
Bill for real says he'd love to sit in on that loot box committee.
I guess. But this is going to include, and this list is straight from The Verge, Activision Blizzard, Bandai Namco, Bethesda, Bungie, EA, Take-Two Interactive, Ubisoft, Warner Brothers, and Wizards of the Coast. According to the ESA, other publishers are also considering the disclosure. They will need to be included for a game to be published on the Xbox, PlayStation, and Nintendo Switch consoles. Other platforms like PC are not included in this commitment. Here's the quote from the ESA, quote, "The video game industry relies on creating and sustaining relationships with our players based on fun, but just as importantly, on trust. One of the hallmarks of our industry is that we don't just create entertainment value for our players, we listen to them," end quote. There's no official word on the timing of these disclosures, but the company is hoping that they will roll out through 2020. So you guys can go check out the article from The Verge to read Microsoft and Sony and Nintendo's responses on this as well. But want to just get you guys' thoughts in general from the top. What do you think of, let's start with just the announcement about loot boxes, because Cody, I'm sure you have things to say about the ESA themselves coming out of this story. But from the perspective of just the way this impacts the market with loot boxes, what are your feelings and reactions?
I've wanted this for a long time. Like, if you're going to have an item people can spend real money on, like, I think you should have to disclose what their actual odds of winning are. So, yeah, like, I think it's a good move. I'm glad to see that aspect of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it addresses a lot of people's concerns about loot boxes. And we'll talk about this in a little bit, but I think there are also other aspects of loot boxes that have yet to be addressed that people should still be concerned about. Namely, like, even if you do know the odds, kids having access to this stuff, or not just kids, minors in general, is kind of a problematic element of loot boxes. But I think for this announcement, I do think this is something that we've all been talking about for a while. It certainly removes a bit of the element of gambling from it if you know the odds. Or at least you can sort of game it as much as you want, or at least you know going into it, so you can choose to whether or not to spend money on it. It's definitely a step, and we'll talk about whether or not it's a big enough step to actually affect loot boxes writ large.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with both of you, but especially with something Larry said of just like, if you're able to spend real money on something, you should be able to understand your chances of receiving the thing that you clearly hope to receive from that purchase. I mean, that's the that's a bare minimum requirement for the lottery. You know, you go and you buy a Powerball ticket, and you know you've got a 1 in however many million chance that you're gonna win money off of it. You know, you go to Vegas and you know the odds. Like, in any of these games of chance, those games are required to publicize your odds of winning. And so I think it's a good step forward. I think it is also clearly a reaction to the pressure that we've been seeing from governments around the world that are trying to regulate them. We've said it multiple times on this show that if the games industry does not want the government to regulate loot boxes, they need to step in and begin regulating them. And I think that Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo clearly listen to this podcast and we're like, you know what, those guys make a hell of a good point. So yeah, I think it's a bare minimum of a step forward, though.
And if the FTC is having a committee on loot boxes, like, the writing's on the wall there. Like, we're in the 11th hour of get your crap in order.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So yeah, we can kind of go beyond that now. Do you think this is going to? Obviously, the public sentiment around loot boxes is at a as low as it can probably be measured at the moment.
Yeah, I would say so.
When a game says it comes out and it comes out and says it's going to have loot boxes in it, the backlash on that is, I think the only thing worse than saying you're going to have loot boxes is saying that you're going to go exclusively to the Epic Game Store.
Yes.
And so, do you think that this kind of change is going to have any kind of impact on that public sentiment?
The public sentiment around loot boxes?
Yeah.
I think people will still, it's so culturally ingrained in a lot of people to always rail against this stuff. Like the moment you hear microtransactions, it's like a dog whistle for a bunch of people. They immediately just start barking.
Mm-hmm.
I do think it'll go a long way toward, once it actually starts being implemented and isn't just talk, I think it will, over time, people will come to understand these things a little bit differently. If you know, again, like you guys were saying, if you know the odds of what you're buying into, you kind of tend to view it a little bit differently. I think a lot of people, loot boxes in particular, view it as a just kind of a, this is what you're going to get. You're going to get shitty stuff most of the time, and you don't really know what you're going to get the rest of the time. So I think it'll help alleviate that. I do think that people still on a philosophical level view loot boxes and microtransactions as something that they're just absolutely opposed to, just as a way to milk more money out of them. So I don't know if it'll curb that, but I think it'll certainly curb people's opinions of what they're doing when they go into buying loot boxes. I think there's people who will just don't buy them in general and probably won't sway them, but the people who do, or do occasionally, it might shift their opinion slightly.
Yeah, I think the word dog whistle's interesting there, because, and the idea that like people have a hard time separating the idea of loot boxes and microtransactions. Like it's one of those like every square is a rectangle, but not every rectangle is a square kind of things. And so even if this shift, because I do think that there is going to have to be a shift with a lot of companies in terms of the way that they craft their loot boxes around this change. I imagine if some of these companies were to publicize their current drop rates for certain items, they are going to be considerably laugh-worthy when it comes down to it. And so it's either going to force them to adjust and say, okay, well, we're going to make these a little bit more favorable to the players, or, well, if we make this more favorable to the players, it's not going to be nearly as advantageous to us, and so we're going to move on to another model. And so this change, I don't think is going to eliminate loot boxes to begin with, but even if it did, there's just going to be another kind of microtransaction that comes up that's going to just as heavily be just as heavily kind of railed against as loot boxes are.
Companies are always going to try to earn money hand over fist.
Yeah, especially when they've been doing it. When you're used to making that kind of money, you're not going to do anything that impacts your ability to continue to make that kind of money. And
people have bought into it. Like even though people complain, people still buy loot boxes.
Yeah. And Larry, I know you had to step away for a second. We're talking about whether or not this change is going to help to improve the public sentiment around loot boxes.
Yeah, to some degree, I think it will. Something, and I know you guys aren't opposed to this, but I do want to make it clear that we need to expect, for anyone that just outright thinks all microtransactions are bad, we can't expect a game like Overwatch to run 3, 4, 5, 6 years without any kind of expenditures. So the people that are just flat out opposed to those things altogether, like either get used to the idea of more expensive games or get used to the idea of some kind of microtransactions. But we definitely want to make sure that it is like a fair and not predatory system. And I think that this does take some strides that way.
Yeah, because Overwatch is a great example, because there's so much content that had Overwatch come out 6-7 years ago, we'd have been charged for every new map that came out. We'd have been charged for every new character that came out. Or the other alternative is, well, why isn't it that we can't just pay a flat rate for a skin that we want or something like that? Not recognizing that if they were to move in that direction, I know the Mercy skin was a skin to help raise money for charity, but think about how much they charged. What was it? Was it $20 for the skin?
I think it was something like that. Yeah.
I think it was $19.99 for that skin. And I'm not saying that's indicative of what every skin would cost, but in order for them to recoup the same amount of money they're probably making through the loot boxes, they're going to have to charge 12, 13, 14, 15 bucks for every legendary skin. And when you put it boldface in front of you, like, this is how much we're actually trying to get out of you with these loot boxes, there is a sticker shock to that. And, they're going to get you one way or the other.
Mm-hmm.
But it also seems like more and more in this industry, companies are starting to move away from randomized loot boxes. In fact, today it was announced that when Rocket League's when Psyonix acquisition by, this is a weird way of saying this, but once Epic acquires Psyonix and Rocket League moves to the Epic store, they're going to be removing all randomized loot boxes from their game. This is similar to what what Epic did with Fortnite Save the World. There are no loot boxes in I'm pretty sure there's no loot boxes in Fortnite Battle Royale, right? It's all like rolled, here's the 4 items that are for sale for the next 8 hours kind of thing, and you can just pay a flat rate for them, right?
I think so.
Yeah.
And the stuff you get in the season pass.
Yeah. So do you think that this is a trend that's starting to take care of itself, and that this is kind of a first move into companies really trying to figure out, okay, well, what's our next model?
Yeah, I think so. Just because I don't think you can get to the point where people don't feel icky about loot boxes, because that sentiment is so ingrained. Whether it's fair or not, the sentiment is ingrained. And if Fortnite in particular is demonstrating one thing, it's that they know how to monetize. Epic knows how to monetize the game. And so as Fortnite continues to be successful, I would expect a lot of people to begin to emulate that.
Mm-hmm. Well, and we've seen games outside of Fortnite have success with that model that they're using. The idea of, like, it's a season pass and you stay engaged and you move forward. Apex, to an extent, they do have randomized stuff that you can actually purchase the randomized boxes, correct? But for the most part, they're trying to recoup their money in the seasons. PUBG is making money hand over fist with the season pass model as well.
Do they still have the loot boxes too, though?
I'm sure they do still have the loot boxes.
Okay.
Yeah,
Apex has. Okay. Apex has the loot box, the whatever they're called, the Apex packs, but they also they've got the season pass, but they also have a store where you can spend currency. There are 3 types of currency in that game, and I think you can buy all 3. You can definitely buy 2 of the 3,
mm-hmm.
and they go toward different things. So
yeah, I think it's the market moves where the consumers move, and as consumers get fed up with loot boxes and that word starts to have a negative connotation with your game, publishers will look to other models. I think this is a step towards trying to put some of the sheen back on loot boxes, just because, again, like we've said, that the sentiment around them is so overwhelmingly negative. Whether, like you said, Larry, whether it's earned or not is another thing, but there's a cultural reaction around the word loot box. And so I think this is a step towards obviously mollifying those concerns, and in the process probably moving in a different direction as well. I don't know where that direction is. I'm not the best person to prognosticate about that particular market,
mm-hmm.
but I think Fortnite's model obviously is working. So that's one way to go. I think there'll still be the hybrid models like Siege and Apex and Overwatch, or not Overwatch, but Siege and Apex, that have seasons in addition to loot boxes. And I'm sure we'll see something we haven't even thought of or seen yet pop up in the next few years.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think another interesting point is that I'm a big sports game fan, And for the most part, those games exist fully on randomized card packs with like FIFA Ultimate Team, Madden Ultimate Team, NBA's My Team. I don't feel like there's as much, not to say it's non-existent, but there's not as much negative sentiment around those things. In fact, like building your Ultimate Team in FIFA and Madden is seen as an event, you know? And I'm curious, I can already start to see the articles being published on Kotaku and Polygon and Player versus All when we're looking at drop rates in those kinds of games where you're buying packs in the hopes of maybe finding like one or two really rare cards and figuring out how to like game the math. And is it better for me to buy 10, and I'm just making shit up, is it better for me to buy 10 platinum packs because I have X amount of chance, or is it better for me to buy 3 of these ultra platinum packs to have a chance at it? Like, we're going to start to see a lot of that happening, I think, especially in these sports games where people take those teams online to compete with them, and it really matters what players you're coming in with. And I'd be interested to hear from Beal for Real in the chat, who's big into the like deck building games.
I was going to say that's another huge place where it's going to take off.
Yeah, Hearthstone, Magic the Gathering, online. And again, those are a lot of those are PC games and won't be impacted by this. But you have to imagine PC's not going to be far behind on these kind of regulations.
Yeah. I also wonder, with sports and particularly deck building games, whether it's more normalized because of where those systems historically have come from. Like, I remember buying packs of Magic cards and just knowing I'm going to get mostly shitty cards and then 1 or 2 rare cards. And just like I remember buying baseball cards and trading with my friends and knowing that I might not get what I want to get. Those are kind of historically embedded in like physical media, and we understand it that way to a certain extent. Obviously it's not the same, but I think it's interesting to note why people may have different perceptions of those as well.
Well, and not to mention that in FIFA Ultimate Team or, Gwent, it is the game. you know?
Yeah.
It's all about the game. Whereas it seems so like the sidecar to all of these other games, but yet it's such a big part of the push when you log into those games. Like, Overwatch, it's skins and voice lines and emotes and victory poses, like nothing that's actually impacting the gameplay, but it's so essential to keep the game afloat for these things to be bought. And it seems like this thing that more so takes away from the game rather than being the game itself. Yeah.
I remember talking with my friend about gaming Hearthstone's card packs, like how many you'd need to buy to get stuff. It's just kind of it's a normalized function of how those games work.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I'm sure that's not the last big change we're gonna be seeing from the loot box front, and so we're gonna stay on top of it. But let's and I'm sure we'll come back to a part of this conversation when we get to your topic, Cody, because it involves the same organization. Actually, sorry, you're next. Transition to you. So
what a smooth segue.
Yeah, you know me, just pulling the levers. I'm the man behind the curtain. So, Cody, talk to me some more about the ESA.
Yes, let's talk about the Entertainment Software Association. And particularly as it relates to the quote that you mentioned and how they use the word trust. Recently, and by recently I mean over the weekend, the ESA, who is responsible obviously for this loot box summit, and also the organization that runs E3, they leaked a spreadsheet that contained the personal information, contact information, personal addresses of over 2,000 games journalists, and other content creators, not just journalists. The spreadsheet was leaked, and it was found that it had been published and publicly accessible on the E3 website for who knows how long. And so I'm just going to kind of run quickly through how this developed, because I think that will also be part of our conversation. This obviously impacted a lot of people, over 2,000 journalists and content creators, and to varying degrees, freelancers who were more likely to put their personal addresses as opposed to their company's addresses in the spreadsheet, and when they registered for E3, were obviously impacted perhaps more so than staff writers who write for publications. Journalists were receiving death threats, calls, and texts more than they receive normally, from very angry people in gaming, quote unquote gamers. You could call them consumers, whatever you want to call them. And the existence of the document was first made public, at least, by a journalist named Sophia Narwitz. I think that's how you pronounce her name. Maybe Narwitz. I'll just call her Narwitz. She publicized the document in a YouTube video that she posted to her personal channel on Friday. And she basically in the video described how people could access the file. She published the video after she had already reached out to the ESA to make sure that the document was down before she published it. And the ESA had said that they took the link off of the site. But even despite that, there was a cached version of the page that people could download the spreadsheet from. So the spreadsheet was still live even as she had posted the video. She had also reached out to journalists who had, a few of whom, in this Kotaku article written by Maddie Myers, a few of whom mentioned that they did not want Sophia Narwitz to publish the video for reasons that we'll talk about. And so eventually the file was taken down, the link was taken down, but obviously a lot of damage had already been done. And the ESA released a statement to Kotaku, which I'll read out in full here, and obviously it connects to the quote you had read, Luke, about your story about trust. But the ESA's explanation for this was, quote, ESA was made aware of a website vulnerability that led to the contact list of registered journalists attending E3 being made public. It once notified, we immediately took steps to protect that data and shut down the site, which is no longer available. We regret this occurrence and have put measures in place to ensure it will not occur again, unquote. And then this is per Maddie Myers' words, but the ESA representative again declined to respond to Kotaku's other questions about why the file was not properly password protected, how long the file had been available to the public, and whether this was the way that journalists' personal data had been treated by the organization in past years. So those are questions we still do not have answers to, as far as I can tell. This is a pretty major story for the ESA, for E3, and for journalists and the industry in general. It hits on a lot of topics we've talked about, I think, in the past, about the relationship between journalists and the people they write for. So before we dive into that stuff, let me just first get your loose thoughts on this, your overall thoughts. What were your first thoughts upon hearing about this story?
It may be terrible, but I guess I'm to the point where I just don't really react to these things anymore. It just seems like company after company after company is just so incompetent that I just need to assume that if my information's been given to anybody, they're going to screw up sooner or later. And that's not to say that I don't think we should hold them accountable or anything. It's just I was more like, again, really? I hope they get $125 out of it, because no one's going to be held accountable.
Mm.
Yeah. Well, my first thought when I saw it was, oh, well, this is going to be an absolute shit show. Because and the $125 thing Larry just mentioned, obviously, about the Equifax leak. And I actually talked about the Equifax leak on the PvA Nightly Rundown on Monday in relation to this story, because that's the leaking of sensitive information that is impossible to change. Mm-hmm. And for a lot of these freelancers, while yes, it is completely within the realm of possibility that they may move, it is completely unreasonable to expect somebody to move because of this. And like, it is causing irreparable damage to these freelancers who have had their information leaked. Like, and just, I mean, it's easier to change your phone number, but there's a massive amount of inconvenience that goes around with that, especially for professionals who work from home and are, you know, so reliant on being able to connect with other people in the industry. To change your phone number and have to, you know, signal blast that out to the people it matters to is just as hard. And so my first thought was it's a shit show. My second thought was like, what was the function of this spreadsheet and why did it need to be hosted online? Like, and you know, I've been thinking about this for a while of just like, what would the function be of a spreadsheet living online like this in the day where we have like password protected Google Sheets where you can just give your people with an at ESA.org email address access to the list if it needs to be accessed. Like, the existence of the list to begin with makes absolutely no sense to me. So
yeah, the public nature of it makes no sense to me. I can understand if you want to have, if you want to give access to like publishers or people who will be at the show so that they can reach out to journalists and like blast them with PR messages. That's normal stuff. And that would be locked behind, like you said, a password protected account, any number of measures put in place to refrain the general public from getting access to it. I don't understand why your home address needs to be on it. That seems like an odd piece of information to be a part of this, other than the fact that like obviously staff writers will have their publications address on there, but that's publicly available regardless. You don't need to have that in this spreadsheet.
I'm wondering if there's some sort of like pre-E3 press kits that go out to some of these.
There probably
places,
is, but I feel like there's probably something you can do that by blasting out a mass email. It doesn't need to be put into one central hub. Obviously, that'd be easier.
Yeah.
But again, if it wasn't publicly accessible in the first place, that would also be easier.
Well, and it almost seems like a side skirting of, a cutting of some corners because, and we talked about this when Sony backed out of E3, that it left a ton of room open on the show floor and there was a lot more smaller companies that were coming in, and maybe it was just the ESA being like, well, we don't want to go through all the hassle, so we're just going to try to create a back-end page where these smaller creators can get access, because otherwise we'd have to get all their email addresses, share out access via that email address, yada, yada, yada. Whereas if we can just create a backdoor portal and hope that nobody finds it, then that'll be fine, you know? It's just a strange and stupid move on anyone's part, but it's like Larry said, like, people don't understand the value of the personal information that they're being given and the measures that they need to take in order to handle that responsibly.
Yeah, this is just sheer incompetence. So I want to preface all of my thoughts before this by saying this obviously hits close to home for me because I am a journalist, and my contact information I give out to a lot of people, the people who I want to contact. If my email address and everything was publicly accessible, my home address was publicly accessible, I would worry. And these people, like a lot of the people on this list already endure a ton of harassment online just through Twitter, but you can block people on that. It's more difficult when it's coming to your cell phone, coming to your personal address, and people know where you live. It's just like the stories that were coming out of this of people crying because they were receiving death threats, people's significant others crying because they were receiving death threats. That stuff is just not acceptable. And this goes beyond sheer incompetence. This is like just active stupidity that should have been noted by an organization that for some reason wields as much name recognition and power as it does in the industry. Like the ESA, we've mentioned the ESA countless times on this podcast for any number of things, from the loot box conference to this and E3. It's just absurd that an organization of that size and notability would make a mistake like this. And yeah, maybe it's naive of me to think companies like this leak information all the time, but when it will have as much of an impact as this will have on the industry, I think we should take them to task for it, because journalists are a large reason that E3 is the thing it is. Journalists are covering this thing constantly, and I think we'll talk about this in a little bit, but the effect this will have on E3 in general is going to be very interesting to note.
Yeah. Well, and talking about some of the stories that have come out of this leak, I think equally as stupid are the number of stories I saw from people who were like, "Hey, I understand you're trying to be encouraging, but can you please stop texting my personal number with your encouraging messages?" Like, how fucking stupid do people have to be? Like, I don't answer the phone when a random number calls me, and I rarely answer if a random number texts me. Like, I don't care what if your message is a death threat or is a positive, like, "Hey, we're thinking about you, be safe in this time." Like, if you don't know the person and they didn't give you their number, like, don't fucking text them. It's not that hard.
Yeah.
I hadn't even seen those. That is so weird.
Yeah, it's an interesting take.
It's somebody trying to get their foot in and hoping to become a friend with, one of these creators. That's what it is. And it's just as creepy and just as dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I do want to quickly address Sophia Narwitz's decision in the first place to publicize this. I think this is an interesting point of conversation because I saw a lot of conversation going around about the lack of responsibility about publicizing how to access the document. Obviously, she was trying to inform people who were on the list so that they could be aware of it. And she had obviously assumed she had taken all the steps to realize that the link was down and that people couldn't access it anymore. She believed that to be the case. But what do you guys think about her decision to publicize this the way she did, or even publicize it in the first place?
I think publicizing that it was possible to do this was a good and necessary thing.
Yes.
Maybe the step-by-step here's how wasn't good. But even that, like once you say, "Hey, this can be done," like there are people savvy enough to. I don't know that it would have made a difference in the grand scheme of things if she'd kept it vague, I guess is what I'm saying. Like once someone knows there's a vulnerability, they're going to figure it out. So I don't know.
Well, and I think that she was under the impression that this was going to be leaked anyway. Like had it on good authority that it was going to be coming out regardless. And I think that I don't know. It popped off says in the chat, got to get those clicks. And, I think that that's a lot of what people are feeling about this. But I also think that you have a responsibility within this. I mean, she did her due diligence to try to make sure that it was not publicly accessible. But what showing how easy it was to access does is it allows us to recognize the sheer incompetence of the ESA and place the blame where it's duly supposed to be placed. Whereas if this would have just been leaked and the story comes out later on that like, oh, this thing, somebody else yada yada leaked it, then it becomes about the person that actually leaked it with like ill intent, rather than the conversation we're having now about like how fucking stupid of the ESA to just have a link on a random page that gave you this. So I don't know. I understand the criticism, especially from the people who were impacted by it. But if you believe it's going to come out anyway, and you've done your due diligence to make sure following these steps is not going to get you to it now, and following those steps didn't get them to it then in the first place, you still had to go in and get the cached version of the sites in order to pull it down. So, I don't know. I get the criticism, but I don't share it.
Yeah, I think she obviously weighed the pros and cons of this probably pretty heavily. And I don't know her background as a journalist or as a content creator, to be honest. But I do think I tend to agree. This probably would have come out at some point within the next 2 days over the weekend. She seems to definitely believe that was the case, which leads me to believe that it probably was the case. And so I think it probably does more good to reveal to people what was happening. Like you said, that to raise eyebrows of people who are on the list and who aren't on the list to what the ESA hasn't done or has done. I also think it was good of her to reach out to journalists in advance to make them aware. Obviously, as many as she was aware of and could notify. That was a great step to take. I think this is one of those things where she would have gotten backlash regardless, and there would have been pros and cons to whatever decision she made, and ultimately she did choose to publicize, and more people are aware of it as a result. But people were still impacted by it. I don't think she could have avoided that from happening.
Mhm.
But I think ultimately she made the best of two probably very shitty choices. But what I do think is worth talking about here, at least for a little bit, is the question I'm going to pose has a very simple answer. And it's one we've talked about before, but I think it's worth discussing again, basically because of how absolutely like clear in the sand this incident drew a distinction between journalists and gamers. My question is, how does this incident point to broader tensions between journalists and gamers? And I think it's probably pretty clear how it kind of makes those distinctions clear and those fault lines very clear. But I'm curious on your guys' behalf, or on your guys' side. We've talked at length about how about Gamergate, about how journalists are bombarded with a lot of harassment, how developers are bombarded with harassment from a very particular segment of the gaming population. I think this incident in particular makes it very clear how far of a divide there is between journalists and at least part of the people that they're writing for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'm going to say anything enlightening or particularly new with this, but I think number one, there is a complete and utter misunderstanding of the roles that journalists play within the grand scheme of the gaming industry, and that oftentimes gamers take out their frustrations on it. It's a shoot the messenger kind of deal in a lot of ways. And you think back to stories like the No Man's Sky delay and Jason breaking that story, Jason Schreier my good pal Jason breaking that story, Jason Schreier from Kotaku, and the amount of shit that he got over just reporting on a story with no bias at all. Like,
no, it's just
reporting the facts, and just because it hadn't been confirmed yet, the amount of shit that he got, and like, in the whole meme of like, oh well, Jason Schreier delayed No Man's Sky, you know, but and yes, that is a meme, but it is representative of the fact that people do not understand the function of journalists and personalities in the gaming industry, and oftentimes take their frustrations out on these people in very extreme and vitriolic ways.
Yeah. I also just think there's a very combative relationship, at least on one side, because I think the job of journalists is to report on the facts. And oftentimes those facts do not jibe with the rose-colored view of a franchise or a game that a lot of people have. And it can oftentimes, journalism is very critical. It's the job of journalists to be honest and to be as objective as you can be, and often that requires a critical perspective on a topic. Fandom is critical, but it's also extremely blindly accepting of things regardless of their faults. And so when journalists come in and start quote unquote criticizing something, fandoms take that as an offense, and they automatically put up their guard and become extremely defensive and oftentimes very hostile. And so I think that dynamic is obviously clearly has been at play, and developers are not great at we've talked about this with Mordhau. They're not exactly great at repressing or kind of controlling that behavior. They oftentimes weaponize the passion of their fan base and just kind of shrug it off. So there's a lot of dynamics here at play, but this incident just kind of reveals those fault lines. Again, nothing new.
And it's not just a gaming thing either. It's like there is a general atmosphere of beating up on the journalists is a popular and okay thing right now.
Especially now, yeah, definitely.
And so in a lot of ways, it's that. I kind of, while you guys were talking, I was thinking back to Luke earlier mentioning the texting a journalist and be like, hey man, I know this time is rough for you. And I think that's part of the issue too, is we live in such a connected age, and there are these opportunities to engage online with people and have conversations. And sometimes we mistake the capacity to connect with with the forging of a relationship. And so I could spend a lot of time watching somebody and reading their content and feel like I know them and not realize that it's kind of creepy for me to cross that line and start communicating with them as though we are good friends who have spent hours together.
Yeah.
I think some people need to think through that.
That happens with my job because we work for a relatively small local paper. People have a sense of their relationship with the paper and with us as reporters. And so there is kind of I think I have a very different perception of my relationship with the readers than they do with me. And so you definitely see that. I think that definitely plays a role in it as well. There's a twisted version of the relationship, or I guess not twisted, but distorted or different perceptions of it. And there's a sense of entitlement that comes with being able to lord over that content.
Yeah. Well, in the relationship, I think is kind of distinct in the gaming space because gaming fandom often becomes the story in these situations. Yeah. So it's like a cyclical kind of thing where news breaks, gamers react in a negative way. The negative reaction receives the coverage, and it's just this loop. And you use the word combative, but I do think that there is, and we've talked about this off air. And forgive me if I'm publicizing something, but how oftentimes we, as people who in a very minor way cover this industry, how often we're like, God, we hate the people that make this industry up because of the shit we've got to cover, the shit we've got to talk about, and I can just, and you can tell from following particular personalities on Twitter that that's the way they feel about it too. Like they love games as a hobby. They love games as an industry and the people creators that they get to interact with. But when it comes down to the fandom, it just sucks to be to have to deal with. And so it becomes combative in a cyclical way. And I'm not saying in any way that justifies any of the responses that we're getting, but it's the nature of just kind of what has been boiling up over, I would say, the last few years, especially within games coverage.
Definitely. And it's disappointing. It's made me question whether I want to do it full time. I'd be fine doing it freelance, but would I really want to write for an audience? And I should say, we're generalizing here. Obviously, these are the loudest voices, and there are people I've interacted with a lot of readers who like my work and have genuinely enlightening conversations with me about it. But there is undeniably a not insignificant portion of the audience that is reacting this way. And I think it's even harder for reporters of color and for reporters who are women or female identifying who have to face this stuff. It's even more difficult, especially when they can target you with having all your contact information.
Yep.
Having seen what my wife deals with just being a woman on the internet, I can't imagine being a woman speaking critically about something in an official capacity on the internet.
Yeah. It's tough.
And, this isn't really gaming industry. This gets beyond that. But I told Luke this in a conversation this week. I wish there'd be a big crackdown on this kind of thing. Like, if you make a death threat through the internet, you should go to jail. It shouldn't be handled like, oh, some guy just got mad on the internet. Throw a few people in jail, and I think some of this will get some people to think twice. Not that it'll solve the problem, but it might dissipate some of it. Right now, I feel like I could. Not that I would. I feel like I could get on the internet and just send a death threat to somebody and nothing's going to come of it, except I might get blocked on a social media platform. And it should be a lot more serious than that.
Yeah. And speaking of repercussions, that gives me a perfect segue.
You're welcome.
I want to talk about the repercussions that you guys think this will have, both for the ESA as an organization, but also for E3 as an event, because obviously the ESA organizes E3. They are inextricably linked with it. What do you think the repercussions will be for the ESA as an organization? We'll begin there, I guess.
Yeah, well, there's already lawsuits being gathered together.
Pending legal action,
and I think that it is going to be a not insignificant amount of money that will have to be paid out in order to make this right, because It is a very defined group of individuals. It's not millions and millions like the Equifax thing. It's a defined group of individuals who have had their information compromised, and it is going to require significant life change in order to feel safe and comfortable again. And so there is pain and suffering costs to be recouped there. And I think that the ESA is going to take a massive lump in having to pay back, hopefully, in damages that they have caused through their negligence. And I don't know much about the infrastructure and the health of the ESA, but I know that oftentimes with E3, the finances of E3 comes up as a topic of conversation in terms of its viability. And so if it doesn't impact the ESA at large in a way that would result in its demise, I can easily see it resulting in E3's demise.
Yeah.
Which at this point, who cares? You know?
Yeah.
Like,
an interesting point I saw someone bring up, and this relates to your point about legal action. Obviously, I think a lot of journalists involved in this have talked about pending legal action. What's interesting to me was that a few people were mentioning something called the GDPR. I don't know if you guys know what this is. The General Data Protection Regulation, which is an EU law. Obviously, the ESA is an American organization, but the effect of this does impact European individuals. And people were talking about the possibility for repercussions based on that law in particular. Because it does extend to individuals who are affected by something, even if it's not within the borders of the EU, which would be another pretty hefty hit for the ESA.
Yeah, so with what I do for a living, we have to consider GDPR, especially for...
oh, great. Perfect.
Especially if we have clients that are marketing to international international customers and so the GDPR is a protection on data collection. So if I have a form that I want you to fill out to download something and I'm asking for your email address and your phone number, number one, I have to be able to justify the information that I'm asking for, and number two, I have to be able to provide a baseline level of protections for that information. And that's where the ESA is going to fall into some trouble because they didn't provide that baseline level of protection for people's submitted personal information. And those things, we turn people away at our agency if it's going to be too GDPR heavy, because it's a headache, and as an agency, you are not cleared as like a third party acting for them if something were to go wrong.
Yeah, definitely.
So I'm just super cynical right now. I'm at a place in life where I've watched legal action fail again and again and again and again. And so I kind of hope that they're held accountable in a significant way. But I'm also sitting here like, if unchangeable personal information is worth $125 a pop, like you and I sitting here, like reasonably, we recognize like it's going to cost a lot more than that for these people to feel safe again. But will a court recognize that? Will the law play out that way? And I'm not optimistic. I feel like they'll get some financial slap on the wrist and we'll all move on. And I sincerely hope I'm wrong. I'm kind of cynical in this area right now.
Mm-hmm.
Fair enough. And I do think that a lot of that cynicism is probably well deserved. How do you guys think this will impact E3 next year?
I mean, I've talked about the financial repercussions already, but there's also the trust factor and with journalists and other personalities.
People already saying they don't want it, they're not going to go.
Yeah, well, and I think Jason Schreier tweeted, like, how is anybody going to be able to ever trust you with our personal information again, you know? And like you said earlier, Cody, E3 is E3 because of its coverage. And if you can't get people through and it's not just GameSpot's coverage and IGN's coverage and coverage from these outlets where it's a company address. It is this industry is being more and more driven by personalities on the internet, and you're not getting it from these outlets. You're getting it from the one singular voice that you trust. And I think that there are going to be plenty of people who will jump at the opportunity of going to E3 regardless of how at risk it puts their personal information. But I think some of the bigger names are going to have to take pause and say, is this something that I really can trust the ESA to protect? And I think you're going to see a lot of people who say no, they can't. And that's going to have a massive impact.
Yeah. So I agree. And assuming that my cynicism is wrong, if they're hit financially, like, it does seem like E3 is just kind of limping along, and I think that could be the death blow. If you have these big names pull out, which is a real possibility, then that could kill it. If both of these things happen, like, I'd be very worried about the future of E3. But I'm not sure how it's going to play out.
Yeah,
we'll definitely see them like really doing the good marketing. Oh, look at all these reasons you can trust us.
Yeah, they're going to be definitely pushing the trust button a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's interesting because we had talked, I think, around E3 or a little bit before about is E3 dead or is E3 over, just with Sony pulling out and a bunch of other places, a bunch of other big names starting to pull out from the developer and publisher side. I think that this definitely does not dissuade our like warning shots about that stuff. I think we all agreed that E3 this was just kind of a weird year for E3 in general because of where it falls in the console cycle. But if a bunch of big names from both the publisher, developer, and press side start pulling out of E3, you're right. That's a death blow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Can't have E3 without the people who make the industry go round.
Exactly. It'll just be a bunch of gamers standing around twiddling their thumbs.
They're going to be like, come to E3, we're going to have the world's biggest loot box workshop.
Now, if you've always wanted to go to E3, this is probably the year.
That's true.
Tons of availability, guys. Oh, man. All right, well, let's move on. Larry, what is your topic?
Let's close out on something a little more positive.
Yeah. We got to get a little dark before we get bright.
Okay.
But this will be positive. So, obviously, in the past week, some real atrocities have been committed, and as is the typical case, instead of us asking the hard questions and making the hard decisions, we've decided to point to video games as the cause of violence. And I don't really want to have that discussion. We've had that discussion. Let me just give it to you in a nutshell, listener, if this is your first time hearing it. In a couple of decades of people actively trying to prove a link between violence and gaming, we've never been able to produce even one study that does it. So that's pretty conclusive. So let's roll past that. Anyone who says that games are definitely causing violence, you can assume that they haven't bothered to even spend 5 minutes reading about it. And you don't even need to listen to them anymore. And all those discussions are important and they're worth having, but I don't really want to discuss do games cause violence again, because I don't think we need to. There are other discussions that deserve to be had instead. But as far as gaming goes, since it's been getting such a bad rap this week, I thought this would be a good week to talk about some of the positive benefits of gaming. In particular, one of the podcasts I listen to is The Art of Manliness, which when I recommended that podcast to my friends, I always say, I know that sounds like a joke and not like a serious site, but it's actually a really good website, and the podcasts are pretty in-depth. But this, in the last couple weeks, they had one dealing with stress. And they spent some time talking about acute stress versus chronic stress, because your body has a stress response, and that's natural and healthy and good. In acute situations, some stressor happens, your body prepares and deals with the stress. But chronic stress is a bad thing when you're staying stressed out all the time. And it's increasingly a big problem for us. And there are a lot of reasons for that, especially in this era where we don't disconnect from anything ever. But one major contributor to chronic stress is rumination. So that's when a stressful event happens, and instead of like the stress happens and you move on, you just keep thinking about it. And the example they give in the podcast episode is you go to your boss's office and he just yells at you for 3 minutes, And so realistically, you've had 3 minutes of stress, but then when you go back to your office and you continue to think about it all day, your body behaves as though you've had an entire day of stress rather than just 3 minutes of stress. And within that discussion, they brought up a study about Tetris, because one way that you can short circuit rumination is by doing something that completely absorbs your focus and keeps your mind from wandering away from the thing that you're doing. So if you just get really invested in doing this activity, you can't ruminate. You can't be trapped in your boss's office getting yelled at all day if you can just disconnect for a little bit. And as any gamer knows, games can be an excellent way to completely distract your mind. Gaming is a great outlet for this. In particular, Tetris was involved in a study that proved these things. So gaming as a distraction can be a healthy thing, and it can prevent us from engaging less healthy forms of distraction. So I guess to start the conversation, have you ever used gaming in this way? Like there's this stress, and to get away from the stress, you go and you play a game.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, it's funny when I have like a particularly stressful week of work and I'm like ruminating about it, which I tend to do because what happens when I have a 3-minute conversation with my boss is I replay it in my head, then I call Larry and talk about it for an hour, and then I come home and I talk to my wife about it for another hour, and then I sit and I stew about it for the rest of the day. And when I have a particularly stressful week, Lauren will always go, it's Friday, once you get off work, just sit down, play a game, just forget about it. And like play a game is always a part of that like step of unwinding, because she just knows that I'm gonna if I play enough Overwatch, I'm gonna find something else to ruminate about, and it's normally whatever Genji's doing.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I've 100% done that as well. I don't know if we're probably going to talk about specific ways we've done that, but the one that springs to mind most immediately for me is Rock Band. I remember throughout undergrad, and actually to a certain extent after in grad school as well, if I was getting stressed out about a final or like a capstone project, or even just like an interaction I had with a friend of mine that was just kind of like sitting ill with me, I would sit down to the plastic drums, take out my drumsticks, and if you're playing drums in Rock Band at expert difficulty on a medium to hard song, not like a fucking like just nightmare song, but medium, like hard to sort of difficult song, it requires a lot of focus and a lot of kind of intense muscle memory and muscle activity. You just have to put everything you have into that song. And so that was a way for me to just like shed everything else. Not only did I have to have my mind attuned to it, I had to have my body attuned to it to succeed as well. So it was just a great way for me to ditch everything, mind, body, and just kind of dedicate it to a game.
Yeah. So, I recognize fully that this was a stupid question. Of course, we've gamed. It's a hobby. It helps us disconnect. It helps us blow off steam. And for me, that's definitely been a big part of why I game. And for sure, there have been points in my life where I probably engaged in it a little bit too much and lost my scholarships in college. Because disconnecting for a while is good, but you can't disconnect so much you don't actually deal with the problems in life.
It's a fine line.
But you do have to be able to get away from the stress for a while. And I should have said this earlier. The two sources that I'm kind of referencing for this, one was the Art of Manliness podcast, episode 525, How to Stress Proof Your Body and Brain. And I highly recommend it. If you're someone who's stressed out, like go give that a listen. And then there was an arstechnica.com article called Tetris is a Great Distraction for Easing an Anxious Mind. So yeah, anyway, you can go too far with it. It can be a problem. And I think gaming is unfairly considered in that category more than it ought to be, because that's true of any hobby. But within that podcast, they had a great discussion about there are a lot of ways to disconnect and to distract, and not all of those are healthy. you can go shopping to make yourself feel better. And if you've got the money to blow, okay, that's fine. But that's probably going to be worse for you than sitting down and playing some Tetris. Some of us eat when we feel stressed, and eventually that your body is going to keep that record as well. Alcohol, use of things like that can be a way that we disconnect, but it's not necessarily a healthy way to deal with stress, particularly when we chronically go back to that item. So in particular, like, games are just a really good way to deal with that. And they used Tetris as the focus on their study because of how zoned in you get on that type of game, even to the point of you're seeing the blocks drop in your dreams. It's a really it's a really obvious example of a game that really sucks you in. But toward the end of the Ars Technica article, they say, quote, one group, they say in regards to one of the studies involving Tetris, quote, one group played the standard adaptive version of the game, where the difficulty level increased as their skill level did. A second group played a version that was too easy, with blocks dropping so slowly as to induce boredom. The third group played the most challenging version of the game, with rapidly dropping blocks designed to create a sense of frustration. After playing, the subjects filled out a survey rating their emotional state, end quote. And they obviously found that the first group had the most success disconnecting from their stress, the standard version where the game got more difficult to match their skill. And so with that in mind, are there particular games that you found lend themselves more to stress relief than others? Are there games that you can't actually play if you expect to relieve stress? What actually helps you disconnect and find that flow state that just sucks you in?
Yeah, it used to be sports games for me that were a really good disconnect, because I never really played like Madden or 2K or anything like that super competitively. But I would go in, and I like to play sim style, so I'm playing like 12-minute quarters in NBA, and I'm playing on a trying to play with like the most realistic difficulty. So it's a good challenge. The funny thing now, though, is within this conversation, like, most of what I play now is competitive, and I'm either playing like League or Overwatch or something like that. And those are not great games to disconnect, because, like I made the joke about earlier, ruminating about, whatever Genji's doing. And so I don't really have, I guess, a game in my life right now. I mean, I'll go into like the training tool on League and like practice clearing jungles or last hitting minions or something like that, like to just kind of disconnect for a minute. But what's actually become more of a disconnect point for me that still involves games is just watching esports, like, because I'm a pretty active watcher of those things, and so I'll watch Overwatch League or the LEC LCS, like, and that helps me to disconnect. But yeah, the more I think about it, the more I'm like, well, the games I play now stress me out in a different way.
Yeah, I don't think I would never be able to play anything competitive to relieve stress. And I'm obviously not playing like Sekiro to de-stress, because that game is just infuriating in its own right. It is something like Rock Band that I think for me requires you to lock in. I think everybody who's played either Guitar Hero or Rock Band for an extended period of time has hit that point where you look away from the screen and you see the notes falling. I think anything like that for me that requires you to lock into a certain rhythm and kind of flow to that rhythm. It's just kind of like a trance-like state you enter into after a while, similarly to Tetris. And like I've genuinely thought about buying that Tetris game that came out last year that's trippy as hell with all the like particle effects, just because it seems like a really great way to like zen out for a few hours. Stuff like that. Like, I can't play anything narrative based, because kind of similar to a movie, my mind may start to wander a little bit, or what's happening in the narrative might connect a little too close to home to what I'm trying to avoid. I can't play horror games. Normally, or if I'm trying to de-stress. Yeah, it's just Rock Band is the thing that I found to be the best. And I think to a certain extent shooters like Halo and Wolfenstein that I've played enough to just kind of get onto their rhythm, and I can just kind of play mindlessly. Horde mode stuff usually seems to be pretty good. Like Left 4 Dead, it was always a great way to kind of unwind if I was just playing by myself.
It's funny. I've got like kind of two real mental hangups within myself just to get a glimpse into my mind. Number one, I have like terrible ADD, terrible. Like, where I always joke like when I'm writing copy that like I'm sure anybody who's a copywriter for a living like would freak out watching me write, because I'll like start with the intro and then I'm like down in the third paragraph and then I come back in and I'll leave a sentence half finished and hop back down to another idea, like because my mind just does not work in this very like linear point A to point B way. And the second thing is I'm super obsessive. Like I get my mind fixated on something. As an example, like a couple years ago, we found one of those like giant ass cockroaches dead in my basement. And all my mind could think of was our house is infested. It's just infested. And so I like looked up this article online and it said, the best way to see if you have live cockroaches in your house is like leave all the lights off in your basement. And then when you go down to your basement, turn as many lights on all at one time as you can, and you'll see them scatter if you have them. And for like a week, no joke, I would like wake up in the middle of the night thinking about it. And I'd go downstairs and I'd flip on all the lights to the point where like I had a breakdown at like 10 o'clock at night one night and was like, we gotta get somebody here to look at the house. Like, and I was like on the phone with Terminex lining up an appointment at 10 p.m. at night. So I'm like super obsessive and I have real bad ADD, and there are two things that are terrible. So like, I've been waiting on some emails to come back in, for some things I've been sending out lately. And I'm like checking my email every 5 minutes. But what games have allowed me to do to bring this home, thank you for walking with me. What games have allowed me to do, like when I'm playing Madden, I'm like, okay, I am not going to check my phone until the end of this quarter, and it allows me to lock in on those things. And I think that's kind of what you're saying, Cody, with Rock Band, is it's this way to like, you have to be focused on the screen for 3.5 minutes while this song goes. And
it's achievable milestones.
Yeah. It gives your brain like that A to B mindset that I just don't have naturally within me. And games do a great job of just like creating order where my life lacks it in many, many ways. So also, Cody, that helps you if you're ever editing an article of mine and you're like, why the fuck is there half a sentence here?
I figured that out long ago. Games are also just great at playing off of OCD in general. Like if you're obsessive compulsive and you're playing a Ubisoft game, you will not stop playing that game for hours on end because it feeds into that thing that's eating away. It does for me. Like I can't stop playing Ubisoft games because I need to check off every tower and every checklist, every check on that check list. It's just, and whether that's healthy or not is debatable, but it definitely does take my mind off of things.
So listeners, if you've got a game that really helps you disconnect and de-stress, feel free to weigh in as well. For me, like I'm with you, like competitive games do not do it. Even if I'm good at the game, like there's always going to be something that upsets me, that makes me angry. And when I think to what helps me disconnect, there are 3 games that stand out in my mind. And reading this article and thinking about this actually made me realize that I don't really have this in gaming. For me, this used to be a big part of why I game, but I'm at this place where all I play are competitive games, and that's why gaming does not help me de-stress the way that it used to. That's why I go to bed angry. But the 3 that stand out to me, one is Animal Crossing back on the GameCube. Like, you had objectives, you had milestones you could pursue if you wanted, or you could just like screw around and do whatever you wanted. And that was really cool. And I haven't played one since that first one. I tried the mobile game, but there was too much trying to get you to buy things for me to like disconnect with that game. So I'm looking forward to the Switch one that's coming out, in forever from now. But when that game comes out, I'll be on that game. The second
spring,
one,
right?
I just expected it. I'm in the boat of I wish this was here sooner. the second game that comes to mind is Minecraft.
Yeah.
And I like to play in survival mode, but even in that, like the game is not so hard that you can't like unwind while you're playing it. Frustrating things can happen, but it's minor frustrations. And I have a particular, Minecraft, if you're playing the classic way of playing it, it doesn't really have any built-in milestones necessarily, but I have a very particular way that I play Minecraft where I like to spawn in a world, establish the main base, and then I try to like map out the entire rest of the world and create outposts from the main base that you can easily get to. And it's sort of my own self-imposed, like it's a very like it's almost a meditative experience to just I'm droning away, overtaking the world. And then the third one is Mirror's Edge. It was the simple, clean environment, and it was more of a puzzle game than anything else. Just it had this packaging that made it look like you were free running and fighting guys with guns, but at the end of the day, it was a puzzle of how can you traverse the environment most efficiently, and it was a great game for me to relax and disconnect with. Yeah, so that's all I've got on the games helping you disconnect. Games get a bad rap sometimes, but there are a lot of benefits to them, and de-stressing is just one of many.
All right. Well, with that said, let's go on to everybody's favorite game to de-stress: Two Truths and a Gaming Lie, Gaming Edition, the game, the movie, the musical.
I'm already stressed.
So, the way that this game works is I have a video game listed here, very obscure, probably nobody has ever heard of. I have 2 truths about this game and 1 lie about this game. Our 2 esteemed panelists here will have to try to suss out which one is the lie. Let's go to the scoreboard, remind everybody where we're at. We're playing first to 10. In the lead, me, with 8 points. How do I get points? Well, if neither of these guys pick the actual lie, then I get the point because I have deceived them. Cody, bringing hot on my heels with 7 points. He can tie it up today. And then Larry, let me do some quick calculations here. Carry the 1. Anybody know the square root of pi? It's still greater than what Larry has because it's 0, because he's got 0 points. All right. You guys ready to play? You understand the rules? Any questions?
At this point, I'm not sure I understand the rules.
All right. Our obscure game this week is a game called, and forgive me if I'm pronouncing this wrong, Horizon Zero Dawn.
I think you got that.
Okay. All right. Here we go. 2 of these are true. 1 is a lie. Number 1. When Guerrilla originally started considering making Horizon Zero Dawn, they tabled the idea because of its similarity to a game called Enslaved: Odyssey to the West. Instead, they began preliminary work on a steampunk-inspired shooter where you fought different monsters, but feared that was too similar to the Order 1886. So after a while, they returned to the idea of Horizon Zero Dawn. Number 2. Aloy's character model is not an original concept from Guerrilla's artists. Instead, it is a licensed image of Dutch actress Hannah Hoekstra. Number 3. In an interview following the game's reveal, narrative director John Gonzalez revealed that he did not want the machines in the game to be referred to as
you cut out for me there.
Yes, I am.
On the third one?
Yeah.
Okay. In an interview following the game's reveal, narrative director John Gonzalez revealed that he did not want the machines in the game to be referred to as dinosaurs because, quote, Guerrilla Games didn't hire a paleontologist to consult on the game, end quote. All right, Larry, we are going to start with you. Which one of these is the lie? The one about the similarities, the Aloy character model, or the reason they're not called dinosaurs?
I think that the first one is the lie.
All right. Coddington, what do you
Can
believe?
you repeat the last one? I didn't hear the whole thing.
In an interview following the game's reveal, narrative director John Gonzalez revealed that he did not want the machines in the game to be referred to as dinosaurs because, quote, Guerrilla Games didn't hire a paleontologist to consult on the game, end quote.
I'll go with the third one.
All right. And finally, after weeks, Cody has caught up to me. It is tied 8-8. I actually don't know why they didn't want them to be referred to as dinosaurs. I just remember they made a very big point.
Because they're not based on dinosaurs.
Sure.
If you listen to any of the dev diaries, all of the movements are based on different animals other than dinosaurs.
Well, that ain't fair. Cody heard the dev diary. I'm kidding.
I knew the second one was true as well. I remember hearing
that one actually came as a surprise to me when I was doing research for this. I didn't realize that. All right, well, we're gonna get out of here, guys. It's 8-0. Cody's very excited about getting out of here.
Wow. Just so pumped. I've been out since my topic.
All right, well, who are you? What are you going to be tweeting about? Where can we find you, and what are you going to be tweeting about this week? Larry, let's start with you.
I'm Larry. You can find me on Twitter at LairHuntsZombies, LARHUNTS Zombies. And I just want the viewers to know that I am committed to trust. So my followers can expect that I am committed this week to giving them accurate statistics of their chances of receiving an epic tweet, a legendary tweet, or a common tweet from me.
Hey, Cody.
Oh, wow. No nickname?
Nah, not this week, man. You really broke my heart with your excitement about this show being over.
My name is Cody. You can find me on Twitter at ProElectioneer. This week, I don't know. I'm going to be gone for most of the weekend, so I probably won't be tweeting too much. But if I do somehow miraculously beat Sekiro this week or early next week in between when we film, you'll most likely see an all caps message of absolute elation on Twitter.
All right. Well,
I'll be proud of you.
I will believe in a god.
Oh, I am Luke Croft. You can find me on Twitter at Luke PvA. And this week, what am I going to be tweeting about this week? I'll probably just send out a tweet every single time I pick up my phone at work, just so you guys can get a sense of how much I pick my phone up. I'm just kidding. I would lose so many followers. It'd be like those weekends where all I do is tweet about the Overwatch League. I'll drop like 10 followers. It'll be great. I had to turn off your iPhone will send you a report of like you spent X amount of hours on your phone this week per day.
It's rough.
I had to turn that off. I don't need that kind of negativity in my life. All right, guys. Well, this has been PvA Radio. We get together each and every week. Each of us brings one of the biggest gaming news stories of the week. Then we have an in-depth discussion about them. Consider it your collaborative audio feature article. And Cody, what do we want people to do with that?
We want you to spam that emote, but we also want you to buy a plane ticket to LA. Fly to Hollywood Boulevard.
Yes.
Or fly to LA, then drive to Hollywood Boulevard.
Yeah,
Stake out a place on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Bare space. Pour some concrete. Write CAFA in there. Put your handprint. Walk away. Let it dry. You're good.
Immortalized forever.
Exactly.
All right. If you can't catch us live over here on twitch.tv/PVA Radio at 9:30 p.m. Eastern Time every single Wednesday, you can find us on youtube.com/PVA Radio the following day or podcast services everywhere, wherever you're listening. We greatly appreciate it. Like somebody in the chat over here, just with the heart. Thanks for stopping by. We appreciate you, and we appreciate everybody else who listens and watches this show. But until next week, guys, we love you. Goodbye.
Why, that's the second biggest monkey head I've ever seen.
I used to be an adventurer like you. Then I took an arrow in the knee.
The definition of insanity.
Would you like me to pick up that shortwave radio?